listing some things that you probably don't know about or haven't heard about because the news media isn't telling you. And I've listed a few of them here. There are a lot more, but some things that I will touch on later in the presentation. And that is that global warming ended in 1998. That may come as a surprise, but I'll show you the data for it. And it is indeed true, and that has been admitted by the chairman of the UN group that has been pushing CO2 as causing climate change. Even he admits there's been no global warming in 15 years. The Antarctic ice sheet is not melting. Contrary to headlines you'll see about every other day that the Antarctic ice sheet is melting at an accelerating rate. It not only is not melting at an accelerating rate, it's not melting at all. The main ice sheet, and I'll show you the data for this, is in fact growing, not melting. So we don't need to fear that the ice caps are going to suddenly melt and cause all kinds of problems for us, because they aren't. Sea level has been rising globally and also locally at a rate of about 7 inches per century, as we're thawing out from a little ice age which occurred about 500 years ago. And the projections of anywhere from 5 feet to 20-foot rise of sea level, as you'll see when I present the data, is beyond reality. Snowfall is not below normal. There have been headlines from time to time about, in the Cascades, certainly, that the snowfall in the Cascades is diminishing because of global warming. That's not true. For the past 5 years, have set snowfall records, both globally and in the Cascades. CO2 cannot possibly cause global warming. That will come as a shock to you, I'm sure. And the reason is that there's so little of it. It is a trace gas. It has increased in its atmospheric content by only 8/1000ths of 1%. If you double nothing, you still get nothing, and I'll comment more about this later. Severe storms are not more frequent than normal. When we get a big snowstorm in the east, they say, oh, it's because of global warming. When we hear about a hurricane on the East Coast, they say it's because of global warming. It isn't. And I will show you data that shows that actually the extreme events, severe storms, are actually declining. They're not becoming more frequent. And finally, you may be surprised to know that the oceans are not acid. Oops.
Mr. Chair? 1 second.
You want to go back?
I think Senator Anker has a question.
Oh.
I'll have several later. Most of them I'll wait until the end. Just on that last point, the oceans are not acid. Are you saying that ocean acidification does not exist, or are you saying the oceans entirely are not acid? I think all of us would agree with that. Nothing is an acid, so.
The oceans are not pH, which is a measure of acidity, is measured on a scale, and 7 is neutral. The oceans have a pH of 8.2, which is alkaline, not acid. And I'll show you why they are not going to become less alkaline, much less more acid, with increasing temperature change, if that in fact were to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify my question, I'll be a little clearer here then. Do you believe that ocean acidification exists in the world's oceans today and here in the Northwest?
No. I'll show you the data. I'll talk about this in detail. If you'd like to wait till I get to those slides, it'll be clearer, I think.
Badly. Thank you.
It's very clear, and I'll show you the data. So what I did was I looked at specific issues that form the basis for Senate Bill 5802, and I listed 6 of them. And so what I did was I pulled out data that relate to all 6 of these premises that are inherent and form the basis for Senate Bill 5802. Regardless of the language of the bill, this is what the bill was based on as of this weekend. And you can read them, but emissions of greenhouse gases is the principal cause of climate change. A lot of data, I'll show you that. Sea level is rising at an increasing rate because of global warming. That's not true. I'll show you the data. Frequency of severe storms is increasing because of global warming. That's not true. Reduced winter storm packs and decreased summer stream flow is not true. Increasing acidification of the state's marine waters. That may or may not be true in terms of the state's marine waters. Certainly it's not true of the oceans globally. And finally, the production of more electricity from renewable energy while phasing out coal-powered electricity generation. I'll just show you some data that shows what this would cost, and without commenting on whether coal plants are good or not. I'm not particularly in favor of coal-powered generation, but there are some numbers you might be interested in. So let's take these one by one. The first one is that greenhouse gases from human activities.
Dr. Easterbrook, Senator Anker has another question.
Can you go back to the last slide? I didn't understand what your point number 6 was trying to get at. I heard you mention coal, that you're not necessarily in favor of coal-fired generation. What's your point there? What are you going to tell us about?
My point is to show you the relationship between coal-powered generation and other forms of electricity generation, how much of it is from each of these categories, and what the cost of each is, and what changing from one to another might involve. I have no opinion on that. I'm just going to show you some numbers.
And how that relates, sorry, Mr. Chair, and how that relates to climate. Or you're just going to show us the costs on the generation?
Well, it relates to climate because the rationale for moving from one form of energy generation to another is climate. Is how much CO2 you put in the atmosphere. If that's not a realistic assertion, then it doesn't matter. But if it is, then there is a concern that it's related to climate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So let's look at greenhouse gases. But before I do that, let me say something about global warming. There's nothing new about global warming. It goes on all the time. It has been going on for thousands of years at much higher rates, much more intense for longer periods of time than we've experienced in the last period of global warming since CO2 began to be elevated. This graph shows temperature on the left-hand side and the date, year on the bottom. And what you will see is that there was a period of cooling from 1880 to 1915. Temperatures were going down. This is a global record. And then from 1950 to 1945, the climate warmed. And then it cooled again from 1945 to 1977. And it warmed again from 1977 to 1999. And since 1999, it has cooled slightly. Not a lot, but slightly. So what does that mean? Well, if we go back to the warming that occurred from 1915 to 1945, shown by this curve here, global warming occurred without any increased CO2 in the atmosphere. This was before the big surge of CO2 emissions after World War II in 1945. So if you want to put a mental line in 1945, that's the breaking point between increasing CO2 and insignificant changes in CO2 prior to that. So this warming took place prior to increased emissions that occurred after 1945 and cannot possibly be ascribed to CO2 as a cause. Cannot be. And then in 1945, global emissions began to escalate very rapidly. And for 30 years, as the escalation continued, and we put more and more CO2 in the atmosphere every year, we had 30 years of global cooling. So the question then is, if we've had escalating CO2, which is supposed to cause global warming, why did we have global cooling during the initial period when CO2 was escalating so rapidly? It doesn't make sense. And then finally, there was a period from 1978 to 1998 when global temperatures rose again, and CO2 was still rising. CO2 has been rising throughout this whole interval. So there's only one period when CO2 was rising at the same time the temperature was. And we can take that back even farther. If we go back 500 years, this graph shows essentially temperature on the left-hand side and the year AD on the bottom. Each one of these red peaks is a warm period. Each one of the blue peaks is a cool period. Climate is not constant. It's changing all the time, and it changes in cycles. Warm, cool, warm, cool, warm, cool, with about a 30-year time span between each one. So we could count these warm periods, and we can count 20 periods of global warming and global cooling that have occurred in the past 500 years, none of which could possibly have been caused by CO2 because CO2 had not begun to rise until 1945. In other words, we have an instance here of 20 periods of global warming, similar to what we've experienced in the period from 1978 to 1998, that could not have been caused by CO2. They were caused by natural causes. That's important. 20 periods of global warming that can only be ascribed to natural causes in the last 500 years. If we go back even farther, if we go back 10,000 years, this is temperature on the left-hand side, sorry, it's not labeled, and these are years before present on the bottom.